How's it going, everyone? Tactard Ted here. It is the 18th of May, 2022. And I'll start today's rant/lesson off with a quote. The quote is from a U.S. Senator whose name was Hiram Johnson. And Hiram Johnson is famous for saying, truth is the first casualty in a war. And by everything that I see going on with the current situation in Ukraine, I think he pretty much nailed that. Now, it may not be the second or third or fourth, but somewhere not too long after truth, common sense becomes a casualty of war. And to be able to highlight that, all one has to do is look at the current situation in the city of Mariupol, which literally fell to the Russians a month ago. But a lot of folks would say, oh, no, Mariupol's contested. Mariupol's contested. Oh, there's still a chance. There's still a chance. Oh, yes, there are Ukrainians. As long as there are Ukrainians in that city, it's contested. Well, did you know really the situation about the Ukrainians in the city? There was about 2,000 to 3,000 fighters of the Ukrainian military, some police, some Marines, and a large chunk of Azov neo-Nazi militants that had taken refuge in bomb shelters beneath the Azovstal steelworks. Azovstal being named for the Sea of Azov, which is where the Azov neo-Nazis get their name from. They took refuge in these 30 to 40 meter deep bomb shelters underneath of the steelworks and basically barricaded themselves in there. Now, the Russians had actually talked about in the early days they were going to shell and storm the place. They started prepping it. They dropped bombs on it. And on the eve of when the great assault was to come, Putin and the military decided to put a halt to it. They said, why send our troops in to die? Why waste our troops? Which is really funny, that they took so much care to keep their troops from having to assault an urbanized terrain, fight in underground tunnels, which would have been a absolute meat grinder. The fighting in and around Azovstal would have just terribly depleted the Russian and DPR ranks. They decided to just go ahead and starve them out. So they cordoned off everything, and they would launch shells and mortars into there a few times a day just to remind the Ukrainian holdouts that, hey, we're here, you're in there, you're not going anywhere. In fact, that we had people saying that it was contested is almost ridiculous. Mariupol was so contested that they had a parade on 9 May. I'm not even kidding, folks. They had a parade in the city. Schools reopened a week before that. That really sounds like a contested city, doesn't it? But yet it's being reported as a contested city. When it came out yesterday that the Azov fighters and the other folks in the Azovstal steelworks were being quote-unquote evacuated, people say, oh my, Mariupol has fallen, Mariupol fell. No, Mariupol fell a month ago. But we are going to play with words. Yes, Mariupol fell because the people in Azovstal are now actually in a proper POW camp instead of a POW camp of their own making. They were surrounded. Nothing much has changed. In fact, if anything has changed for these folks, they're getting better treatment. They had no food, no medical conditions, and were sleeping rough. The Russians have allowed them to get cleaned up, get a shower, seek medical attention. They're still surrounded by Russians. They're still in Russian-controlled territory. Nothing's really changed. But the optics are just off the scale, folks. Because you are actually have people saying, well, they're being evacuated. Okay, a little history lesson, folks. Back in the early 80s, a group of the Palestine Liberation Organization were surrounded in the city of Beirut, Lebanon. They were surrounded by the Israelis. The Israelis wanted to destroy them, but the UN stepped in, and there was a brokered deal. And the PLO guys were told not to shoot. They were evacuated to a seaport. They got onto ships, and they went elsewhere. They kept their weapons. They kept everything else. That is an evacuation in time of war. Dunkirk was an evacuation. The Germans had the British with their backs up against the sea, and they managed to be evacuated by ship to England. That is an evacuation. They took their weapons with them. They did not surrender. What we had happen, and is currently ongoing in Mariupol, is we're having fighters ceasing to resist, laying down their weapons, and going into confinement of their adversary. I hate to tell you, that's a surrender. When you cease to resist, you lay down your weapons, and you submit to the will of your adversary. That is not an evacuation. That is a surrender. Yet we're playing with the words. And there is so much garbage out there right now. There is so much misinformation. And it's coming from the same direction all the misinformation's been coming from. It's coming from the Ukrainian side. It's coming from the U.S. media side. Actually, there is a story out there that makes it sound like the UN and the IRC, International Red Cross, had a huge deal to play in this, yet they didn't. Actually, what happened, if you really want to get to the crux of this, is over the weekend, the Russians, as they so often do, decided to unilaterally offer to open up a corridor, a humanitarian corridor, to allow out the wounded in Azovstal. These guys who are just in wretched condition, their flesh is rotting, they're in wet, damp conditions, and allow them to come out and be treated. And they would be taken to somewhere in the DPR and given treatment. That offer came over the weekend. When they actually opened the corridor, you had roughly 300 people come out on the first day. Only 51 of them were wounded. It was almost immediately, once these guys who were trapped in Azovstal saw their chance to get out, they decided to get out. They ran to the Russians. They threw their stuff down. Now, interesting thing about humanitarian corridors. There were humanitarian corridors opened several times by the Russians during the siege of Mariupol. Every single time the humanitarian corridors were shelled, they came under fire when civilians were trying to leave Mariupol. Now, the Russian army in the DPR doesn't have a beef with the people of Mariupol. For those of you who are lacking the basic understanding of what happened in 2014, there was a referendum in Mariupol. The people of Mariupol wanted to leave the authority of Ukraine. They wanted to become part of the Donetsk Republic that was being formed. They wanted no longer a part of Ukraine. So when the Russians came in with DPR forces, the people of Mariupol were not the enemy. And when you laugh about people saying that Mariupol is liberated, it literally was liberated. The Russian-speaking populace of Mariupol was liberated. All you need to do is look at the violence that occurred there when they voted to leave. That's one of the reasons the Azov Battalion had a huge presence in Mariupol. It was because Mariupol wanted to secede. They wanted to leave what they considered the dictatorship, the dictatorial regime they were living under. Interesting, those humanitarian corridors that were open for civilians were constantly shelled. They were closed. The Russians opened one for the very same people they've been fighting, the very same people that have been committing a long list of atrocities against the people of the Donetsk Republic. And somehow that humanitarian corridor doesn't get shelled. What does that tell you? It should tell you something very, very simple, folks. The humanitarian corridors that were shelled, that were laying out civilians, were shelled by Azov. They were shelled by the Ukrainian military. They weren't shelled by the Russians. You need no more proof than this. The Russians come in there wanting to win the hearts and minds of anybody who wasn't on their side, when most of the people were already on their side. They open up humanitarian corridors and they get shelled. Yet you're dealing with the people who want out, the people you've been fighting tooth and nail. You open up a corridor to get them out, and surprise, surprise, nobody on the Russian side shelled it. That's because the Russians didn't shell the other corridors either. Once this thing is over, folks, once this thing is over and people start applying common sense again, which people are not doing, especially not in our media, it's going to be interesting, because there's going to be a lot of things that come out that we don't expect, that we don't see. And the worst part is Zelensky mischaracterizing this, and his willing accomplices in the media mischaracterizing this as an evacuation. And if you say it's a surrender, well, that's Russian misinformation. No. The misinformation is coming from your media. 110%. And if you can't understand that right now, as we're speaking, over 2,000 militants, some of the best soldiers in Ukraine, as far as Zelensky's been singing their praises, are laying down their arms. They're quitting. They're absolutely quitting. They're giving up the fight. Now, these are the same folks who told you literally a week ago that they were going to carry out to the end, that they were going to fight to the end. There was no surrender. Surrender was not an option. And now, to save face, we're not surrendering. Well, yeah, you did. You surrendered. And anybody with 2 coins to rub together for brain cells would be able to see that it's a lie, to be able to see that they've been misled. And most people don't have the common sense. It's amazing. It's amazing to me, as a United States military veteran, the amount of times I've been called a Putin bootlicker or a Russian bot for expressing an opinion that doesn't fit the mainstream narrative or the general consensus of what reality is. It's been shaped by the media. Look, I hate to tell you folks, when I joined the military, I took an oath to defend and protect and defend the Constitution of the United States of America against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Number one, that doesn't say anything about Ukraine. In fact, when I took my oath, Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. But what I did take an oath to defend was freedom of speech. And I like using my freedom of speech. I like expressing my opinion. And the fact that a lot of people don't have respect for freedom of speech goes to show me that we have a lot of people here that don't understand the military. They don't understand why people say things that they don't like. I say them because I have the right to say them. And I have an opinion based in my perceptions, also based in the information that I've been given. And I'm able to take A plus B and get to C. Now, I've had conversations. I had a conversation with a gentleman yesterday. He and I disagreed on a lot of things. After we talked, and I don't typically block people. I block. The only time I block is when, hey, friend, I just saw you. Hey, handsome. this sort of nonsense. Those people that contact you out of the blue. Now, if somebody, hey, I see you stand with this side, or you're not with Ukraine, explain yourself. And I don't mind explaining myself. I have no problem explaining myself on Facebook to people. And I don't simply block people because we disagree. That's called freedom of speech. I don't live in an echo chamber. But it's amazing to me how many people want the echo chamber. And it's no longer, freedom of speech. You no longer have rights. If you don't echo exactly what they say, the only option you have is to shut up. Well, number one, I'm not going to shut up. Number two, I do have that right. In fact, the right that you have to tell me to shut up was protected by me when I was in the service. So you got a right to tell me to shut up, and I've got a right to tell you I ain't going to shut up. And I got a right to keep on going. You can tell me you want me to shut up. That's fine. You can try to intimidate me, which that's a lot of what's going on now, is we want to intimidate folks not to use freedom of speech, but I don't have to listen. In fact, I can tell you to just go pound sand, and I do a good bit. Anyhow, folks, I'm a minute over my time limit, so I will talk at you tomorrow, and we'll see what kind of new nonsense comes about.